Behind the golden gates of Versailles, in the most opulent palace ever built, lived a king whose public image was carefully crafted perfection. Louis XV, the beloved sovereign of France, appeared to his subjects as the embodiment of royal dignity and divine authority. But what if I told you that this same king, who ruled over 25 million souls, spent his evenings dressed as a chambermaid, crawling on his hands and knees through secret passages? What if the Sun King's successor had appetites so twisted that even his own courtiers would have been horrified? Today we're pulling back the velvet curtains on one of history's most carefully guarded secrets: the sexual deviancy that rotted the French monarchy from within. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see the grandeur of Versailles. The truth isn't just shocking, it's absolutely terrifying. And the most disturbing part? The evidence has been hidden in plain sight all along. But first, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, how far would you go to keep your darkest desires secret? Because Louis XV was willing to risk everything, including the future of France itself. To understand the depths of Louis XV's depravity, we must first appreciate the magnificent facade he maintained. By the 1730s, Versailles had become the beating heart of European culture and politics. The palace sprawled across 2,300 rooms, each more lavish than the last, where 8,000 courtiers lived in a carefully choreographed dance of etiquette and power. Louis XV, known to his people as Louis the Beloved, had inherited this vast empire at the age of 5, and by his 20s had grown into everything a king should be: tall, handsome, intelligent, and seemingly devoted to his Austrian queen, Marie Leschinska. The official court records paint him as a model of royal virtue, attending daily mass, hunting with aristocratic grace, and holding audience with the gravity befitting his divine appointment. His marriage produced 10 children, a testament to royal duty fulfilled. Foreign ambassadors wrote glowing reports of his refined manners and sharp political mind. The courtiers who surrounded him spoke in hushed tones of his natural authority and magnetic presence. Even his mistresses, and the court acknowledged he had them, were portrayed as sophisticated ladies of quality, befitting a king's romantic nature. Madame de Pompadour, his most famous paramour, was celebrated as a patroness of arts and learning, their relationship seemingly elevated above mere carnal pleasure. This was the version of Louis XV that appeared in official portraits, in court gazettes, and in the carefully managed propaganda that reached the common people of France. But beneath this polished surface festered a reality so disturbing that it would make the most jaded modern observer recoil in horror. The truth began emerging in fragments during Louis XV's later years, whispered by disgraced servants and bitter former courtiers. But the full scope wasn't understood until historians gained access to private correspondence centuries later. The king's appetite for sexual humiliation went far beyond anything his contemporaries could have imagined. In specially constructed chambers beneath Versailles, rooms that don't appear on any official palace plans, Louis XV engaged in elaborate role-playing scenarios that inverted every principle of royal dignity. He would spend hours dressed in servant's clothing, forced to perform menial tasks while being verbally and physically abused by carefully selected partners. These weren't simple costume parties or theatrical diversions. They were meticulously planned psychological degradations where the most Christian king of France willingly subjected himself to treatment that would have been considered torture if applied to common criminals. Witnesses described scenes where Louis crawled naked through mock kitchens while being whipped by women dressed as kitchen maids, begging for scraps of food like a dog. Other accounts detail elaborate mock trials where the king was accused of various crimes against his supposed social betters, prostitutes and actresses hired to play noblewomen, and would sob real tears as he accepted humiliating punishments. The sexual acts that accompanied these degradations were so extreme that even the libertine standards of 18th century French aristocracy couldn't accommodate them. We're talking about a man who held the power of life and death over millions, who was believed by his subjects to be appointed by God himself, voluntarily reducing himself to the status of the lowest street beggar for sexual gratification. The woman who orchestrated many of these scenes, and who ultimately held more real power over France than any minister or general, was Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, better known to history as Madame de Pompadour. But the elegant, cultured image she carefully cultivated was as much a lie as her royal lover's public persona. Born into the bourgeoisie, she had clawed her way into the king's bed through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and an intuitive understanding of his deepest psychological needs. Pompadour didn't just become Louis's mistress. She became his psychological master, the puppet master who pulled the strings of absolute monarchy from the shadows. She understood that conventional seduction would never hold a king who could have any woman in France. Instead, she offered him something far more addictive: the complete surrender of his royal identity. In her private apartments, connected to the king's chambers by a secret staircase, Pompadour created a world where Louis could experience the ultimate forbidden pleasure, being powerless. She hired actresses, prostitutes, and even genuine servants to participate in increasingly elaborate humiliation rituals. These weren't random encounters, but carefully scripted psychological dramas designed to feed the king's pathological need for degradation. Pompadour would often watch from the shadows as Louis, dressed in torn peasant clothing, was made to confess imaginary sins while being beaten with switches. She documented his reactions in a secret journal, studying his responses like a scientist examining a laboratory specimen. The psychological hold she gained through these sessions was absolute. Louis became utterly dependent on her for access to these experiences, giving her unprecedented influence over French policy and appointments. She didn't just rule through sexual favor, she ruled through sexual control, understanding that a man's deepest shame could be transformed into the ultimate leash. The corruption didn't stop with secret chambers and private degradations. It infected every aspect of royal governance and ultimately contributed to the events that would destroy the monarchy itself. As Louis's addiction to these elaborate sexual humiliations intensified, his ability to function as an effective ruler deteriorated dramatically. Cabinet meetings were postponed or canceled entirely when the king was recovering from particularly intense sessions. Foreign policy decisions were influenced not by strategic considerations, but by Louis's psychological state following his latest bout of ritualized self-degradation. The most catastrophic example came during the 7 Years' War, when Louis's inability to focus on military strategy, his mind constantly preoccupied with planning his next humiliation session, contributed directly to France's devastating losses in North America and India. The secret costs of maintaining his private world of degradation were astronomical. Beyond the bribes needed to ensure silence, the king was paying for increasingly elaborate sets, costumes, and scenarios. Entire wings of lesser palaces were converted into themed environments for his role-playing: mock prisons, fake peasant hovels, elaborate torture chambers disguised as legitimate royal apartments. The financial strain contributed to the fiscal crisis that would eventually trigger the French Revolution. Even more disturbing were the human costs. Servants who glimpsed too much were quietly eliminated, their deaths disguised as accidents or sudden illnesses. Women who participated in the king's degradation rituals and then threatened exposure found themselves imprisoned in convents or simply disappeared entirely. The monarchy's spy network, originally designed to protect state secrets, became primarily focused on concealing the king's sexual pathology. By the 1760s, more royal resources were being devoted to maintaining Louis XV's secret world than to governing France itself. The final revelation that sealed Louis XV's historical infamy came through his relationship with Madame du Barry, the woman who replaced Pompadour as royal mistress and who pushed the king's psychological degradation to its absolute limits. Born Jeanne Bécu, she was a prostitute who had worked the streets of Paris before catching the attention of court pimps who specialized in unusual services. What made du Barry perfect for Louis wasn't her conventional beauty, but her complete lack of moral boundaries and her intuitive sadism. She understood immediately that the king's previous mistresses had only scratched the surface of his need for humiliation. Under her influence, the sexual rituals became genuinely dangerous, incorporating elements of breath play, blood, and psychological torture that left permanent scars on the king's psyche and body. Court physicians, sworn to secrecy under threat of death, treated injuries that couldn't be explained by hunting accidents or falls from horses. The king began exhibiting signs of genuine mental breakdown, periods of catatonic depression alternating with manic episodes where he would wander the palace corridors in servant's clothing, apparently believing he actually was a lowly scullery maid. Du Barry's apartments became the true seat of government, as she extracted state secrets from the psychologically shattered king during their degradation sessions and sold them to foreign powers. The woman who had once sold her body on Parisian streets was now literally selling France itself, using the king's sexual shame as leverage for treason. The final horror came in Louis XV's last months, when courtiers reported seeing him crawling through the palace's service corridors at night, apparently searching for du Barry to beg for punishment sessions even as smallpox ravaged his body. He died not as a king, but as a broken, psychologically destroyed shell of a man, his last words reportedly being a plea for forgiveness, not to God, but to the prostitute who had completed his psychological destruction. The tremors from Louis XV's secret life continue to reverberate through history, influencing events and revelations that most people never connect to their true source. The financial chaos his hidden expenses created directly contributed to the conditions that made the French Revolution inevitable. The massive debts, the weakened royal authority, the complete loss of respect for monarchy as an institution. But the psychological damage went deeper than economics. The next generation of French royalty, having grown up surrounded by whispers and half-glimpsed evidence of their predecessors' depravity, developed their own dysfunctional relationships with power and sexuality. Marie Antoinette's infamous excesses weren't just royal indulgence. They were desperate attempts to create a clean, beautiful world that could somehow wash away the stain of what had happened in those secret chambers. Even today, certain sections of Versailles remain closed to public tours, officially for structural reasons, but actually because they contain evidence of modifications made for Louis XV's sexual rituals that would be too disturbing for general audiences. Historians who have gained access to these areas report finding implements and furniture whose purposes are unmistakably sexual, but whose specific design suggests practices so extreme that they remain classified in academic archives. Some researchers believe that key evidence was deliberately destroyed during the Revolution, not by angry peasants, but by surviving courtiers who understood that certain truths were too dangerous to preserve. The most chilling possibility is that Louis XV's psychological pathology wasn't unique, but represented a pattern of sexual dysfunction that infected other European monarchies of the period, a secret epidemic of royal depravity that historians are only now beginning to uncover. If you found this exploration of history's darkest secrets compelling, subscribe to our channel for more revelations that will change how you see the past. And tell me in the comments, what other royal mysteries do you think are still waiting to be exposed? Because if there's one thing Louis XV's story teaches us, it's that the most shocking truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look behind the golden facades of power.